Have you ever noticed how a single light can make the night feel less alone? Out on the edge of a small American town, there's a lamp that has burned quietly for years. It doesn't call attention to itself. Its glow is soft, the kind that slips between the branches of old apple trees and spills onto the gravel path like a warm memory. On certain evenings when the air is cool and the sky wears the last colors of day, you can stand at the end of that path and see the lamp waiting. It feels less like an object and more like a presence, steady, familiar, as if it remembers you, even if you've never been there before. Tonight, I'd like to take you there, to the house beyond the orchard, to the man who tends the light, and to the quiet hours that unfold beneath its glow. All you have to do is let the day slip away. Have you ever noticed how the day begins to loosen its grip even before the sun is fully set? The light grows less certain, sliding softly from gold to amber, and then to the muted blue that belongs only to evening. It's at that hour, when the air is neither day nor night, that the orchard takes on its gentlest voice. Out on the far edge of town, where the gravel road bends past a weathered fence and the land opens to a quilt of fields, there is a stand of apple trees. Their trunks are not perfectly straight. Years of wind have taught them to lean and curve in ways that make them seem more human than wood. The bark is thick and furrowed, holding in its lines the record of every season. The wet springs, the dry summers, the winters when ice clung stubbornly to every branch. Beneath those trees, the ground is soft with a mix of moss and fallen leaves. If you stand still long enough, you'll hear the slow rustle of what the day has left behind. A faint sigh in the branches, the distant call of a bird settling for the night, and the quiet breathing of the earth itself. Just beyond the orchard, half hidden behind a tangle of lilac and sumac, is an old wooden house. Its paint has long since faded to the color of oatmeal, but the boards still hold the scent of cedar if you press your cheek to them. On its side porch, a lamp glows with the steady patience of something that has outlasted many winters. The light is not sharp. It doesn't slice through the dark. Instead, it pulls gently around the porch rails, slides over the worn steps, and drapes itself across the grass like a soft blanket. This is the home of Mr. Alton. To the people of the town, he's simply Alton, or the man with the orchard. He's lived here longer than most can remember, and in that time, he's grown accustomed to the rhythm of things. The way the land wakes and rests, the way neighbors come and go, and how the lamp once lit each evening seems to keep watch until morning. Inside, the air is warm, with the scent of apples stored in wooden crates against the far wall. A kettle sits ready on the stove, its metal sides catching the low light from the lamp outside. There's no rush to boil the water. In this house, everything waits its turn. The clock in the hallway ticks steadily, its sound measured and unhurried, as though it knows the evening is long and there's no need to press forward too quickly. Alton moves with that same unhurried grace. When he steps out onto the porch, the boards give a gentle sigh beneath his weight. He wraps both hands around a chipped mug of tea, letting the heat seep into his palms. From here, the orchard is a darkening sea of shapes, each tree a shadow leaning into the next. The last of the daylight still clings to the very tops of the branches, catching for a moment on the few leaves that remain. There's comfort in this sameness, in the way each evening arrives much like the one before it, yet never feels quite identical. Perhaps it's the air, cooler tonight than yesterday, or the way the sky holds a touch more purple. Perhaps it's the quiet knowledge that the lamp will shine the same way tomorrow, no matter what else might change. Alton takes a slow sip of tea, his gaze traveling along the faint line of the path that winds through the orchard. He's walked it thousands of times, in boots that crunch through snow, in shoes that kicked up the dust of summer, and barefoot on spring mornings, when the grass was wet enough to darken his cuffs. The path carries more than footsteps, it carries the weight of years, the echoes of conversations, and the hush of solitary walks taken simply to listen to the wind. Tonight, that wind is mild. It threads its way through the branches, carrying with it the faintest scent of river water from miles away. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barks twice and then falls silent. Closer by, a night bird calls out, its voice deep and low, before the orchard returns to stillness. There's a certain peace in knowing that the world can be quiet without being empty. Alton feels that peace settle into his shoulders, easing the weight there. He leans back in his chair, listening to the lamp hum faintly as the night gathers itself around the house. It's a sound most wouldn't notice, but after so many years, he's come to recognize it. A soft, steady whisper, like a companion breathing beside you in the dark. The tea is nearly gone now, though there's no hurry to refill it. Time in this place doesn't move in minutes or hours. It drifts like the shadows sliding slowly across the grass. If the night brings anything, it will arrive gently, without fanfare, as naturally as the lamp's glow spilling into the orchard. And so he sits, hands resting on the curve of the mug, eyes half closed, listening to the deep, patient heartbeat of the land. Somewhere beyond the edge of the trees, the town begins to turn in for the night, but here, in the circle of lamplight and apple trees, it feels as though the world is content to pause a little longer. Morning in the orchard does not arrive all at once. It seeps in slowly, the way warm water spreads through a shallow basin. First comes the paling of the sky, a thin gray light that touches the tops of the apple trees, softening their edges against the fading darkness. The world holds still in that half hour before sunrise, as if even the wind is reluctant to stir. Mr. Alton wakes without the urgency of an alarm. His body has learned the rhythm of this land. He opens his eyes when the air in the room has shifted from cool night to the faint warmth of day. The quilt is heavy on his legs, its weight familiar, like a hand resting gently on his knee. He lies there for a while, listening to the quiet tick of the hallway clock, feeling the stillness stretch. Beyond the window, a faint mist drifts low among the trees. It blurs the ground and makes the orchard look like a dream half remembered upon waking. From somewhere far off, the call of a mourning dove breaks the silence, low and tender, as though it's speaking only to the morning itself. When he finally rises, the floorboards are cool beneath his bare feet. The scent of cedar lingers in the air from the small fire he had built in the stove the night before. He moves through the kitchen without hurry, placing the kettle on the stove, his hands working by memory more than sight. The quiet is so deep that the click of the stove knob seems almost too loud, so he moves slowly, letting each sound find its place in the room. While the water warms, he steps out onto the porch. The lamp, still faintly lit from the night, glows like a pearl in the morning fog. It's always the last light to fade, and sometimes he wonders if the lamp itself knows it is allowed to rest only when the sun has taken over. The air is cool enough that he draws his sweater closer. Somewhere in the grass, a cricket makes a half-hearted attempt at song before falling silent again. The world feels as though it's holding its breath, waiting for the first touch of sunlight. When the tea is ready, he pours it into a plain white mug, its rim worn smooth from years of use. He carries it to the small table on the porch, where a single wooden chair waits. From here, he can see the orchard stretching away in long, gentle rows. The trees are spaced so evenly that from certain angles they seem like a congregation, each trunk a quiet listener standing in its appointed place. He takes the first sip slowly. The steam rises and disappears into the cool air, and with it, the last traces of sleep leave his body. His thoughts, however, do not rush to fill the space. They drift like the mist over the ground, soft and unhurried. There was a time, years ago, when mornings began differently. The orchard had been noisier then, full of voices, laughter, the sound of baskets being set down in the grass. In those days, he'd rise before the sun out of necessity, the harvest waiting like a responsibility that could not be delayed. Neighbors would arrive, their boots damp from the dews, and the day would unfold in a steady rhythm of work. Now, the work is slower. He no longer keeps the pace of those years, but the orchard remains faithful. Even without the same number of hands, it offers what it can. A few baskets of apples in the fall, blossoms in the spring, shade in the summer. The trees ask for little in return, only that someone notice them, walk among them, and perhaps from time to time speak aloud a word of thanks. He sets his mug down and leans forward, elbows on his knees, watching the light begin to change. It comes quietly at first, a pale gold that catches on the highest branches, turning the mist into a thin veil of silver. Then the sun itself peers over the far ridge, and the orchard shifts from shadow into color. The bark on the trees shows its rough texture, the grass glistens with dew, and in the distance a single bird lifts into the air, its wings scattering droplets like a handful of beads. The warmth touches his face, and for a moment he closes his eyes. It is enough to be here, to feel the light on his skin, to breathe in the faint sweetness of the earth waking up. There is no need to reach for more. The morning has already given its gift. He will walk the rows today, though there is no real task demanding it. It is a habit, and habits, he has learned, are the threads that hold the days together. He will check the low branches for signs of pests, note which trees are in need of pruning, and perhaps gather a few windfall apples to leave on the porch for anyone passing by. For now, though, he remains in his chair, hands cupped around the mug, letting the tea cool between sips. The lamp has gone dark at last, its duty complete for another night. In its place, the sun stands watch, filling every shadow, warming every surface, even the old porch boards beneath his feet. The day has begun, but here in the orchard it will unfold at its own pace, and Alton will match it, step for quiet step. By the time the last of the mist has pulled away from the grass, the orchard is fully awake. Not in a noisy way, it is never noisy here, but in the subtle shift of things that have left the night behind and stepped gently into the day. The air feels cleaner now, as though the morning light has rinsed it clear, and each breath carries a faint, sweet trace of apples and damp earth. Mr. Alton stands at the porch railing, fingers resting lightly on the worn wood. The paint has long since faded here, smoothed by his hands over countless mornings like this one. From this spot, he can see the first 2 rows of trees in their entirety, and hints of the many more that stand behind them, quiet and watchful. The orchard has its own kind of patience, the kind that comes from decades of growing, weathering and waiting without complaint. He steps down from the porch, his boots pressing into the cool, springy earth. The grass here is still wet enough to darken the leather, but he doesn't mind. There's something satisfying about starting the day with the feel of the land against him. The air carries the low hum of bees moving lazily among the blossoms, a sign that, in their quiet way, the trees are already thinking ahead to fruit. Walking between the rows, he lets his hand brush against the low branches, fingers tracing the ridges of bark. In certain places, the wood is rough and scarred, marked by the years, a reminder that even the most steadfast things bear the record of their living. A few petals cling stubbornly to the grass, pale and delicate as if they could vanish with the next breath of wind. There are memories here, woven into the orchard like threads in a cloth. He remembers the days when children ran between the trees, their laughter threading through the branches like ribbons of sound. He remembers baskets set down in the grass, hands reaching up for apples high enough to make the picker's shoulders ache. He remembers the old neighbors, some gone now, some moved on to other places, who came to share in the harvest, their voices warm with the kind of conversation that doesn't need to be rushed. These days, the orchard is quieter. It belongs more to the wind and the light now than to any group of people. But even in its solitude, it offers company, a different sort of companionship, built not on words, but on presence. He pauses beside a tree older than himself, its trunk wide and knotted, its roots pushing up the soil in thick, gnarled curves. Beneath it, the ground is shaded and cool. A few small apples, early drops from last season's stubborn branch, lie in the grass, their skin wrinkled but still carrying the scent of autumn. He crouches to pick one up, turning it over in his hand, remembering the long afternoons of sorting fruit, deciding which would be eaten fresh, which baked into pies, and which pressed into cider that would warm the winter months. The sky above has deepened into a steady blue now, the kind that promises a fair day. Overhead, a hawk circles in a slow spiral, its shadow sliding soundlessly over the orchard floor. Somewhere to the east, a tractor hums faintly, a neighbor starting his own work for the day. The sound is distant enough to feel more like a memory than a present moment, a faint reminder that the town still moves and works beyond these trees. Alton walks on, following the gentle curve of the path that winds toward the far edge of the property. Here, the trees grow closer together, their branches knitting into a canopy that dapples the ground in shifting patterns of light and shade. He stops to watch the way the wind moves through the leaves, turning them one by one so that the sunlight flashes like a slow ripple over water. It's a quiet show, one that no one else might see today, but it feels given to him all the same. By the time he circles back toward the house, the sun is high enough to touch the porch roof, casting the lamp's post in a short, squat shadow. The lamp itself, unlit now, still holds a presence, a kind of watchfulness that lingers even in daylight. He steps onto the porch, pausing to wipe the damp from his boots on the old woven mat. Inside, the air is warmer, the faint scent of the morning's tea still clinging to the kitchen. He will spend the rest of the morning on small tasks, mending a loose hinge on the back gate, sorting through the jars in the pantry, perhaps sweeping the porch boards where the wind has carried in a scatter of leaves. None of it urgent, all of it the kind of work that folds into the day without demanding it be changed. And as he moves through these quiet hours, there will be no hurry. Because here, in this house and among these trees, life does not measure itself by the clock, but by the steady rhythm of small, faithful things. By the time the morning edges into midday, the light over the orchard has softened, as if it, too, has decided not to hurry. The shadows have drawn back from the base of the trees, leaving wide open spaces where the grass shines in its own quiet green. A few bees still work among the blossoms, but their movements are slower now, their hum no longer the urgent note of early morning. Inside the house, the air is warm, with the mingled scents of wood and apples. Mr. Alton stands at the kitchen table, slicing a loaf of bread he baked 2 days ago. The crust breaks with a gentle crackle, revealing the soft, pale center. He sets the slices aside, and without really thinking about it, adds a small wedge of cheese to the plate. Enough for a simple meal before heading into town. His trips into town are not frequent these days. There is little he needs that the orchard and the pantry do not already give, but from time to time it is good to see the faces of neighbors, to hear the steady, unpolished music of conversation. In a place like this, where the pace of life is kept by the turning of the seasons, each familiar voice is part of the land itself. He steps onto the porch, a light jacket over his shoulders. The lamp stands beside him, its glass catching the midday sun and scattering it in a way that makes it seem, for a moment, as though it still carries its own light. He closes the gate behind him and follows the gravel path toward the main road. The stones shift softly under his boots, each step a sound he has known for most of his life. The road into town passes a field of early wheat, its green blades trembling in the smallest breeze. Along the ditch, dandelions have begun to bloom, bright, stubborn dots of yellow against the darker grass. From somewhere far off, he can hear the faint thump of a woodpecker at work. It is a slow, steady sound, like a heartbeat muffled by distance. By the time the first rooftops come into view, the sun has settled high in the sky. The town, small as it is, lies comfortably between 2 low ridges, its main street lined with maple trees just beginning to leaf out. The buildings here are weathered but cared for, brick and wood holding the marks of years without bitterness. On the corner stands the post office, its single door propped open to let in the fresh air. Alton steps inside, the wooden floor creaking under his weight. Behind the counter, Mrs. Calloway looks up from a stack of envelopes. Her hair is the silver white of birch bark, and her smile is one that gathers warmth as it reaches her eyes. "Afternoon, Alton," she says, her voice carrying the gentle rise and fall of someone who has spoken to the same neighbors for decades. He nods, returning the greeting with the quiet ease of long acquaintance. There is no mail for him today, but that has never been the only reason for coming. They speak for a while, about the weather, the river level after last week's rain, and the way the orchard looked in bloom from the ridge road. Nothing urgent, nothing to settle or decide, just the slow weaving of connection, the way people in small towns keep each other in the fabric of their days. From the post office, he walks a short distance to the general store. The screen door sighs open, its hinges groaning in a voice he has heard since boyhood. Inside, the air smells faintly of coffee and the faint sweetness of penny candy that has been in the same glass jar for years. Mr. Lewis, the storekeeper, is bent over a ledger, but he straightens when Alton approaches. They speak of the planting season ahead, the late frost everyone hopes will not come, and the rumor that the old mill by the river might be repaired this summer. It is the kind of talk that asks nothing more than to be shared, like bread set out on a table between friends. With the small sack of flour and a handful of nails, Alton makes his way back through the sunlit street. The walk home feels unhurried, each step carrying the soft echo of the conversations behind him. At the edge of town, the fields open wide again, and the line of the orchard appears in the distance, dark and steady against the lighter hills beyond. By the time he reaches the gate, the afternoon has begun its quiet turning toward evening. The light slants differently now, slipping between the branches in long, gentle shafts. He pauses for a moment, looking toward the lamp on the porch. It stands silent for now, but he knows that soon its glow will spread over these steps once more, steady as the heartbeat of the place itself. Inside, he sets the flour on the counter and drops the nails into the old tin where such things are kept. The house feels just as he left it. The faint scent of bread still in the air, the soft creak of the floorboards as he crosses the room. Somewhere outside, a bird begins to sing its last clear notes of the day. It is enough to stand still and listen, letting the sound find its place in the quiet, just as he does. By the time the afternoon begins to lean toward evening, the light over the orchard has taken on a softer tone, a kind of gold that feels less like daylight and more like a memory the day wants to keep for itself. It falls in long, slanting beams through the branches, laying quiet stripes of light and shadow across the grass. The air, still warm, has lost the edge of midday, and there is the faintest suggestion of coolness waiting in the hours to come. Mr. Alton stands at the porch railing, a mug of water in his hand, watching the slow drift of a few high clouds. He can feel the change in the air, the same way he's always felt it, long before he learned to name the seasons or mark their passing on a calendar. It is something that comes into the skin and the bones, an understanding that the day is closing in its own unhurried way. The lamp, still dark, waits beside him. Its glass is clear, but if you look closely, you can see a faint trace of dust caught at the edges, the kind that no amount of polishing can quite erase. It is the kind of dust that belongs to a thing which has stood faithfully in the same place for many years, part of the air, part of the weather, part of the life lived around it. He knows he will light it soon. Not yet. There is still too much light in the sky, but in an hour or so, as the sun slips behind the ridge, its glow will take the place of the day's warmth. It is a ritual he has repeated more times than he could count, and one he would not think of breaking. The lamp is not just for him. It is for anyone who might pass along the road at night, or for no one at all except the orchard and the stars. After a while, he steps down from the porch and walks the familiar path toward the western edge of the property. This is where the oldest trees stand, their trunks thick and leaning, their roots rising like knotted rope through the soil. Beneath them, the grass grows uneven, and the ground dips in shallow hollows that catch the evening shadows before the rest of the orchard. He pauses by one particular tree, one he has known since his boyhood. It is here, years ago, that he and his father stood on a warm September day, the air heavy with the smell of ripe fruit. They had filled baskets together, the apples cool and smooth in their hands, each one giving a faint snap as it left the branch. His father had said very little. He was not a man for many words, but the way they worked side by side, the steady rhythm of their hands had spoken enough. Now, standing in the same place, Alton can almost hear that quiet between them again. The orchard holds such silences well. It keeps them safe, tucked between the rustle of leaves and the steady hum of the soil's own breathing. A breeze stirs the branches overhead, loosening a few petals left over from spring's bloom. They drift down slowly, turning in the light like scraps of paper from a letter never written. He watches them land on the grass, knowing the ground will take them back without fuss, folding them into its own slow work. The sun has begun its descent in earnest now. The light on the ridge is deepening to amber, and the orchard floor is shifting into cooler shades. He makes his way back toward the house, taking the long route that curves past the vegetable patch. The rows are neat, the soil dark and loose from recent tending. Here and there, tiny shoots are pushing through, green signs of the work still to come. By the time he reaches the porch, the first hints of dusk are gathering in the corners of the yard. The lamp's glass catches the dimming light and seems to hold it for a moment, as though testing its own readiness. He steps inside, finds the box of matches on the kitchen shelf, and returns to the porch with the easy familiarity of habit. The strike of the match is a small sound, but it seems to echo in the quiet. The flame blooms quickly, steadying as it catches the wick. In a moment, the lamp is alive, its glow warm and unwavering, casting a gentle circle of light that spills down the steps and onto the path. He settles into the porch chair, the lamp at his side, and listens to the evening gather itself. Somewhere far off, a train whistle sounds, low and lingering, as though it, too, is reluctant to leave the day behind. Closer by, a cricket begins its patient rhythm, and another joins in until the sound becomes a kind of heartbeat for the night. In the fading light, the orchard looks different, less a place of work now, more a place of rest. The rows of trees are softer, their edges blurred by the deepening dusk. The path through them, so clear in daylight, is now a thread of shadow leading into the quiet. He breathes in slowly, the coolness of the air carrying a trace of wood smoke from somewhere down the road. The scent mingles with the faint sweetness of the orchard, and for a moment he feels as if he is sitting inside a memory, one that belongs not just to him, but to anyone who has ever ended a day in the company of such light. The lamp burns on, steady as a promise. It asks for nothing, yet gives enough to make the darkness seem less vast. And in its circle of glow, Mr. Alton feels the day come to rest, content in the knowledge that night has arrived gently as it should. Night comes gently here, the way a tide rolls in without rush. One moment, the orchard still holds the last amber threads of daylight in its branches, and the next, the color has drained into soft blue, like ink dissolving in a bowl of water. There is no sharp line between day and night, only a slow folding in of shadow, and the steady hum of the world adjusting itself to rest. From his chair on the porch, Mr. Alton watches the orchard change its shape under the lamp's glow. The circle of light around him is small, but it feels enough, as if the lamp is not meant to chase the dark away, only to make a place for it to settle nearby without harm. Beyond that circle, the trees become silhouettes, their branches reaching upward into a sky that is already beginning to carry the first few stars. The sounds of the day have thinned out. Somewhere down the road, a door closes with a soft thud, and the faint murmur of voices drifts for a moment before slipping back into silence. Closer by, the orchard is alive with smaller noises. The whisper of leaves stirred by a passing breeze, the soft snap of a twig as some small creature moves unseen, the even, patient chirp of crickets keeping their own quiet time. Alton leans back, the wooden chair creaking under his weight, and lets the night air settle over him. It carries with it the mingled scents of the season, the sweetness of apples stored in crates by the kitchen wall, the dry, dusty note of fallen leaves, and somewhere far off, a trace of wood smoke from another chimney in the valley. These are not new smells to him. They are the same each year, as familiar as the lines on his own hands, but they have never grown dull. He closes his eyes for a moment, listening not for any one sound, but for the whole of it. The orchard, the night, the house behind him, all folded together into one quiet presence. It is in this kind of listening that he feels most at home, as if the land is speaking in a language too slow for hurried ears. When he opens his eyes again, the lamp's glass has caught a single moth. It flutters for a moment against the warm glow, then settles on the metal frame, its wings opening and closing in a slow, tired rhythm. He watches it with the same attention he might give to a neighbor's story, not out of any need to interfere, but simply to honor its small part in the night. There are memories that belong to evenings like this. He recalls summer nights from decades ago when the porch was fuller, when his wife would sit beside him with her knitting, and the children would play in the yard, their voices carrying into the orchard until the dark made them quiet. Those nights had their own kind of fullness, but this quieter version holds a different peace, one that comes from having lived enough years to know that each season brings its own gifts and none needs to be chased. The sky has deepened now to a richer blue, and the stars are beginning to gather in earnest. They appear slowly at first, one or two scattered like forgotten seeds, and then, as if agreeing among themselves, they come in clusters until the whole dome above is freckled with their cold, steady light. From where he sits, he can just make out the curve of the ridge against the horizon, its shape softened by distance. A faint rustle draws his attention to the edge of the porch. A small, familiar shape emerges from the shadow. A stray cat that has been visiting for weeks now. It moves without hurry, its paws silent on the wooden steps, and settles a few feet away, curling itself into the kind of patient waiting only animals know. Alton says nothing, but he shifts his chair slightly so the lamp's light spills just far enough to reach the cat's resting place. In a few minutes, it closes its eyes, as if the light itself is enough to keep it company. Time in the night hours feels different. It does not pass in minutes and hours, but in the cooling of the air, in the deepening of shadow, in the slow settling of all things toward stillness. Alton stays there a while longer, his hands resting on his knees, his eyes moving between the lamp's warm glow and the orchard's quiet dark. The thought comes to him, as it sometimes does, that the lamp is less a tool and more a promise, that no matter how long the night, there will always be a small, steady light waiting to greet it, and perhaps, in some way, he can't quite name. That is what keeps him lighting it each evening. Not habit, not necessity, but the belief that such small faithfulness matters. Somewhere in the branches, an owl calls once, its voice low and sure. It is answered from farther off, and then the silence folds back in, thicker now, ready to carry the hours ahead. Inside the house, the hallway clock chimes the hour, soft, muted, as though it too knows not to startle the night. Alton rises, stretching the stiffness from his back, but leaves the lamp burning. It will keep its watch while he sleeps, its light a quiet thread connecting the porch to the orchard, and the orchard to the sky. He steps inside, closing the door gently behind him, and the sound of the latch settling is the last noise before the night claims the rest. It was the kind of night when even sleep seemed to move slowly. Somewhere in the distance, a train passed along the far side of the valley, its whistle carried faintly on the wind. Not enough to disturb, only enough to slip into a dream, and settle there like a line of music half remembered. Mr. Alton woke not because anything called him, but because his body had decided in its own quiet way to rest a moment in wakefulness. The room was cool and dark, the weight of the quilt heavy over his legs. From where he lay, he could see the faintest thread of gold slipping past the edge of the curtain, the lamp's light keeping its watch outside. He listened first, not for any particular sound, but for the presence of the night itself. The house gave its small, familiar murmurs, a soft creak in the beams, the faint ticking of the hallway clock, the gentle sigh of wood cooling after the day's warmth. Beyond the walls, the orchard breathed in the slow, deep rhythm it kept through every season. Rising quietly, he slipped his feet into the worn slippers by the bed and pulled his sweater over his shoulders. The floor was cool underfoot, smooth in some places, scuffed in others, each mark a memory of steps taken long ago. He moved through the hallway without lighting a lamp inside. The glow from the porch was enough to guide him. When he opened the door, the air met him with a soft touch, neither cold nor warm, but holding the scent of damp leaves and distant water. The lamp stood steady beside the porch railing, its flame slow and sure behind the glass. The light did not push hard against the darkness, it simply invited it closer, making a place where both could exist side by side. The orchard was different at this hour. Its outlines were softer, its rows less certain. Even the nearest trees seemed to lean inward, as if they had drawn together to speak in voices too low for the day to overhear. Farther out, the darkness deepened into a shade so complete it felt almost solid, a presence rather than an absence. He stepped down onto the grass, the dew already cool against the thin soles of his slippers. Each step released a faint scent from the earth, as if the ground itself had been holding its breath all day and could finally let it out. Above him, the sky was wide open, stretched taut with stars, so many that the darker patches between them looked like quiet pools of water. Halfway along the path, he stopped to listen again. The crickets kept their steady rhythm, and somewhere from the far edge of the orchard, an owl called once, a low, rounded note that seemed to travel farther than sound should. The air was still enough that he could hear the faint rustle of leaves as a small animal moved through them, then stilled again. He found the old bench that sat just inside the orchard's edge. Its wood was worn smooth from years of sun and rain, and when he lowered himself onto it, it gave the softest groan, the kind of sound that welcomes rather than complains. From here, he could see the lamp on the porch, its glow a steady point in the dark. It reminded him of the lanterns his father used to hang in the barn on winter nights, when the snow piled high against the doors, and the air inside was warm with the smell of hay. Memories come differently at night. They do not rush in or demand to be told. They arrive like the breeze, slipping through the leaves and into the mind before you realize they're there. He thought of evenings when the children were small, when they would wake restless from a dream and he would carry them out to the porch, pointing at the constellations until their breathing slowed again. He could still remember the weight of a small head resting on his shoulder, the way the lamplight would catch in their half-closed eyes. A moth brushed past his cheek, drawn toward the lamp's glow. For a moment it hovered in the air, wings catching the light before disappearing back into the dark. He followed its path with his eyes until there was nothing left to see, only the steady glow it had been moving toward. The night was unbroken, yet it did not feel empty. It held the orchard, the stars, the lamp, and him, all resting together in a kind of shared stillness. He stayed there until the cool began to settle into his bones, then rose and made his slow way back along the path. At the porch steps, he paused one last time, letting his gaze rest on the orchard's quiet outline. The lamp would keep burning until morning, a small promise to the dark that there would always be a light to meet it. Inside, the house received him with its familiar warmth. He returned to bed, the quilt closing over him like the orchard's own shadow. Sleep came easily, this time, slipping over him without effort, like the night folding around the lamp outside. Morning does not arrive here with a single burst of light. It begins in quiet changes. The way shadows pull back from the base of the trees, the way the dark blue of the sky thins and softens until it becomes something closer to silver. The lamp on the porch still burns, its glow faint now in the company of the growing day. It stands like a guardian finishing its shift, ready to step aside and let the sun take over. Mr. Alton wakes in the familiar way, not to an alarm, but to the subtle sense that the night has fully folded itself away. The quilt is still warm over his legs, its weight comforting rather than heavy. He lies there a moment, listening to the low tick of the hallway clock and the faint stirrings of the house. It is the same each morning, and yet each time feels new enough to be worth noticing. He rises slowly, slipping his feet into the waiting slippers. The wooden floor is cool, and the air still carries the clean edge left by the night. Through the window, he can see the orchard standing in the first light, the trees casting long, gentle shadows across the grass, their branches still touched with dew. In the kitchen, he fills the kettle and sets it on the stove. The sound of water pouring is small, but in the stillness of morning, it seems to take up the whole room. While he waits for the water to heat, he steps onto the porch. The lamp's light flickers slightly in the breeze, as if acknowledging him before it fades entirely in the day's brightness. He reaches out, turning down the wick until the flame slips away, leaving only the faint scent of warm metal and glass. It is always a gentle thing, this passing from lamplight to daylight. No fanfare, no clear line where one ends and the other begins. Just a slow, unspoken exchange between two kinds of keeping watch. With the lamp now resting, he leans on the porch railing and takes in the orchard. The air smells of damp earth and the faint sweetness of blossoms, a scent that seems to travel further in the morning air than at any other time. Somewhere high in the branches, a bird begins a hesitant song, as if testing the day before committing to it fully. Its notes are scattered at first, then find a slow rhythm that folds into the quiet around it. The kettle's soft rattle calls him back inside. He pours the hot water over a spoonful of tea leaves, watching as the steam curls upward, catching the light through the small kitchen window. The scent rises with it, warm and steady, carrying the promise of the first sip. He takes his mug back to the porch and settles into the chair. The wood beneath him is still cool from the night, but the air is already carrying a hint of the day's warmth to come. From here, he can see the faint track that winds between the rows of trees. It is nothing more than a strip of grass worn by footsteps, but to him it is as much a road as any paved street. A road that leads to work, to memory, and sometimes to nothing more than the act of walking itself. He sips slowly, letting the tea linger in his mouth before swallowing. The warmth spreads through him in a way that is more than physical, reaching into the part of him that has always been nourished by such mornings. This is not the hurried drink of a man trying to reach the day ahead. This is the company of the day as it comes, step for step, breath for breath. As the sun climbs, the orchard shifts in color. The shadows shorten and the greens take on a brighter tone. The dew begins to lift from the grass, turning into faint threads of mist that drift upward and disappear. From where he sits, Alton can see the sparkle of light on each branch, as if the trees are carrying their own small lamps in celebration of the day. He thinks about how many mornings he has watched this same scene. It would be easy to think they all blend together, but he knows better. Each carries some small difference, a particular slant of light, the call of a bird he hasn't heard in months, a change in the wind that hints at the next season's arrival. These are the details that make a life rich in ways that do not need to be counted. After a time, he sets the mug on the railing and stands. The day will bring its tasks, though none of them press hard against him. He will walk the orchard, perhaps tend to the small patch of vegetables near the fence, maybe check the gate on the north side where the hinge has begun to sag. There will be time for all of it, and time for pausing between each thing. Before stepping down from the porch, he glances once more at the lamp. Even in its quiet state, it holds its place, a reminder that light, once given, does not vanish completely. It lingers in the way the morning feels, in the ease with which the day begins, and in the certainty that when the night comes again, it will be there to meet it. By mid-morning, the orchard had taken on the calm rhythm it would keep for the rest of the day. The light was full now, but not yet sharp, and the air still carried that early softness that made each breath feel clean. From the porch, Mr. Alton could see the shimmer of dew fading from the grass, the last of it retreating into the soil as though it had only stopped here to rest. He finished the last sip of tea, set the mug on the small table beside his chair, and rose with the ease of someone who never hurried the start of his work. The day's tasks were not written anywhere. They lived instead in his memory, in the subtle cues of the land, in the quiet noticing of what had changed since yesterday. A light breeze stirred as he stepped into the yard, bringing with it the scent of damp wood and the faint sweetness of blossoms. It was a scent that made him think of years when the orchard was younger, when the branches were thinner, the trunk smoother, and his own steps quicker. Back then, mornings like this were full of movement, ladders carried to and fro, baskets arranged in neat lines, voices calling from one row to the next. He could still recall the way those sounds carried across the open air, each one blending into the other until the whole place seemed to hum with a kind of gentle purpose. Now, the orchard kept a quieter company. The trees had grown thicker in the trunk and broader in their shade. They had the look of things that had learned to stand without fuss, letting the seasons come and go without any need to prove themselves. In their stillness, Alton found a comfort deeper than the bustle of past years. He walked the main path between the rows, boots brushing against the grass, hands occasionally reaching out to touch the bark as he passed. Some trunks felt rough under his fingers, the grooves deep from decades of growth. Others still held patches of smoother wood, as if the years had spared them a little longer. When he reached the far edge of the orchard, he paused near a tree that leaned slightly to the east. It had been like that for as long as he could remember, its trunk shaped by a windstorm in the early years. Most would have straightened it with ropes and stakes, but his father had said to leave it be, that it would find its own balance if given the chance, and it had. Even now, its branches were full and even, stretching wide as though to prove the point. From here, the view opened to the meadow beyond, a sweep of grass that bent easily in the breeze. He stood for a while, watching the way the sunlight spilled across it, how it shifted from gold to green as the wind moved through. It was the kind of sight that asked nothing of him except to be noticed, and he gave it that without hesitation. Turning back toward the house, he took a different route, one that wound past the smaller patch of vegetables near the fence. The soil here was dark and soft, still holding the memory of last night's coolness. Tiny shoots had begun to appear, thin green threads pushing upward, steady in their quiet work. He crouched to brush a bit of soil from one sprout, then left it to its growing, knowing it needed nothing more from him today. By the time he reached the porch again, the sun had climbed high enough to warm the boards underfoot. He stepped inside for a moment, bringing out a small crate from the corner of the kitchen. It was old, the wood worn smooth from years of carrying fruit, and though it would not be filled today, it felt right to keep it near. He set it down at the edge of the steps, a quiet reminder of the seasons to come. For now, the day was still stretching itself open. The light was kind, the air easy in his lungs, and the orchard stood around him like a gathering of old friends, each one with its own story, each one content to let those stories rest unspoken. He knew he would spend the next hours moving slowly among them, checking for broken branches, watching for early signs of pests, and simply being there. Not because the orchard could not stand without him, but because it was in his nature to walk its paths, to be part of its breathing in and out. And as he set out again, the lamp, now cold and quiet in the daylight, stood at his back, its presence a reminder that each day, like each night, was held together by the small and faithful things that never asked for more than to be kept. By the time the sun reached its highest place in the sky, the orchard had settled into the stillness of midday. It was not the stillness of an empty place, but the kind of pause that comes when even the smallest creatures decide there is no need to move too quickly. The breeze had slowed to a whisper, stirring only the highest leaves, and the air was warm enough that the scent of grass rose softly from the ground. Mr. Alton walked the western rows at an unhurried pace. He carried nothing with him, no tools, no baskets, only the habit of moving among the trees to see what the day might be offering. His shadow, long in the morning, was now drawn in close at his feet, its edges blurred by the bright light. The orchard's shade offered welcome relief. He stepped beneath the wide canopy of an old tree, its branches bending low enough that he could rest a hand on one as he passed. The bark felt warm in the sunlit patches and cool in the shadowed ones, as if the tree itself were holding two seasons at once. A pair of robins flitted from branch to branch above him, pausing just long enough to glance his way before resuming their search among the leaves. It was under this tree, many years ago, that he had eaten his midday meal during the long days of harvest. He could see it clearly in his memory, the ground spread with fallen leaves, the basket of apples beside him, the bread and cheese unwrapped from a cloth. Back then, he would finish the meal quickly, eager to be back at the work that filled the hours. Now, he allowed himself the gift of lingering. The ground here sloped gently toward the lower meadow. From his place in the shade, he could see the sunlight pooling in the open grass below. The color of it was different from the light in the orchard, less filtered, more direct, and it made the meadow seem almost golden. The sound that reached him from there was the slow, dry rustle of grass leaning against grass. He found a spot where the roots of the tree rose just high enough to make a seat. Sitting there, he leaned his back against the trunk and let the stillness settle around him. The warmth of the day soaked into his shoulders, while the shadow cooled his legs. A bee wandered past, its path slow and curved, as if it, too, were in no hurry. The minutes passed without measure. In the distance, he could hear the faint hum of a neighbor's tractor, but it came and went with the wind, never close enough to disturb. The more he listened, the more he could hear the orchard's quieter sounds, the tick of a twig settling, the faint patter of something small dropping from a branch, the almost imperceptible creak of wood shifting under its own weight. When he finally rose, he brushed the bits of leaf and grass from his trousers and followed the path toward the house. The sun had moved just far enough west to throw longer shadows from the eastern trees, laying a soft lattice of light and dark across his way. In a few hours, those shadows would grow longer still, and the lamp on the porch would take up its evening work again. At the porch steps, he paused for a moment, looking back across the rows. The orchard stood in its full summer shape, every branch carrying the easy weight of its leaves, every trunk rooted deep in the same soil that had held generations before him. It was a sight he had known all his life, yet one that never failed to quiet him. Inside, the house was cool and dim. He poured himself a glass of water from the earthen jug on the counter and stood at the sink, watching a butterfly drift past the open window. It moved with the same unhurried grace as everything else in this place, turning and rising on wings that seemed too slight to carry it so far. When he sat down at the kitchen table, he could feel the stillness of the orchard resting in him. The day was only halfway through, but already it felt complete in some way, as though the simple act of moving through it, of noticing its quiet offerings, was enough to give it shape and meaning. And outside, beyond the cool shade of the porch, the lamp waited silently, knowing its time would come again when the day leaned back into the arms of the night. By the time the afternoon began to tip toward evening, the light over the orchard had shifted into something gentler. It was still bright enough to see the far fence clearly, but the edges of every shape had softened, as though the sun itself had grown tired of the day's sharpness and was content now to pour its light more slowly, letting it spill over the branches in long, steady lines. Mr. Alton stepped out onto the porch, holding a small tin pail half filled with water. He had been in the kitchen, rinsing the dust from a handful of fresh-picked carrots and setting them aside for supper. The pail was for the flowers near the porch steps, a row of old clay pots, each with something green growing in it. Some held the bright red of geraniums, others the soft blue of forget-me-nots, and one pot, cracked along its side, held nothing more than a sprig of mint that had grown stubbornly through 2 seasons of neglect. He poured the water slowly, watching it sink into the soil, darkening the surface before disappearing into the roots below. The smell rose up, damp earth mixed with the faint scent of clay, and he breathed it in, the way a man breathes in the memory of something he's always known. The breeze was different now from the one in the morning. It carried a cooler edge, sliding down from the ridge to the west, bringing with it the smell of pine and the distant sweetness of cut hay. The fields beyond the orchard had been mown that week, and even from here, he could picture the neat rows of golden grass drying in the sun, waiting to be gathered before the weather turned. He took the long way down from the porch, stepping onto the grass rather than the path. The ground was uneven in places, and he could feel the small give of the soil beneath his boots. Here and there, patches of clover caught the light, their leaves folding slightly as the breeze passed over them. He moved toward the lower edge of the orchard, where the trees gave way to an open strip of grass that ran along the fence line. It was here, in the late hours of the day, that the light seemed to collect, lingering as though reluctant to leave. The shadows of the trees stretched long and narrow across the grass, their shapes bending slightly with the slope of the land. He stopped beside one tree, not the oldest, but one with a history of its own. It had grown from a sapling he planted nearly 30 years ago, a thin whip of a thing back then, barely taller than his shoulder. He remembered pressing the soil around its base with his boot, his youngest son watching from a few steps away, holding the empty burlap sack the sapling had come in. The boy had been small enough to carry then, though too restless to stay in one place for long. Now, the tree stood taller than the roof of the house, its branches spread wide enough to shelter 2 people in the heat of summer. The memory was not a sharp one, not a moment fixed in perfect detail, but a gentle blur, like a photograph left too long in the sun. It was not the accuracy of it that mattered, but the way it felt to remember. A few leaves fell near his feet, turning over and over in the breeze before coming to rest on the grass. They were not yet the full gold of autumn, but carried the first faint hints of change along their edges. It was early for that, but he knew the orchard kept its own time. He walked back toward the house as the light grew lower. From this distance, he could see the lamp on the porch, still dark, its glass catching a pale reflection of the sky. It stood waiting, as it always did, without expectation or impatience. Inside, he set the pail by the door and moved through the kitchen, opening the back window just enough to let the air flow through. The sound that came with it was light and spare. A single bird calling from the far trees, the soft whisper of leaves touching in the wind. He moved a chair closer to the window and sat for a while, resting his hands in his lap. This was the hour when the day seemed to breathe differently. The heat had gone from the sun, but the cool of night had not yet taken hold. It was a time in between, when the world seemed to hover, suspended in its own pause. He thought of the evenings when the house had been full, when the table by the window had been crowded with plates and the air had been warm with talk and laughter. Those evenings had their own weight, a fullness that pressed gently against the walls. This evening was different, lighter, quieter, but still full in its own way, full of the orchard outside, full of the steady promise of the lamp that would soon be lit, full of the small tasks that tied one day to the next. As the sun slid lower, he rose and stepped back onto the porch. The sky had taken on a deeper color now, a kind of blue that made the first stars seem closer than they were. The lamp was ready, and so was he. In a few minutes, its glow would join the slow-turning night, and the orchard would once again be held in the gentle circle of its light. By the time Mr. Alton stepped back inside, the last edge of sunlight had already slipped behind the ridge. It left the rooms of the house in that brief blue hour when the shapes of things are still visible, but all their colors have grown softer, as though the day itself were exhaling before giving over to night. He moved through the kitchen without turning on the overhead light. The lamp on the porch had been lit a few minutes earlier, and its glow reached faintly into the room through the open door, casting long, quiet shadows along the wooden floor. The air carried the coolness of evening now, along with the faint sweetness of apples stored in their crates, and a hint of wood smoke drifting from somewhere down the valley. On the counter sat the carrots he had washed that afternoon, their orange muted in the dim light. Beside them, a small loaf of bread waited under a clean cloth, and a wedge of pale cheese rested on a worn cutting board. It was enough for supper. He had never needed more than a few simple things to close the day. He set a pot of water on the stove, striking a match to the burner. The small whoosh of the flame sounded louder than it should have in the stillness of the kitchen, but it was a friendly sound, a sign that warmth would soon spread through the room. He moved slowly, letting each small task have its moment, slicing the carrots into thin coins, laying them into the pot, adding a pinch of salt from the small jar by the stove. While the carrots simmered, he cut 2 slices from the loaf, the bread giving way with a soft crackle beneath the knife. The smell of it, warm and faintly sweet, rose into the air, blending with the earthy scent of the cooking vegetables. He poured a small glass of water from the earthen jug, its surface still cool from the day's shade. Outside, the lamp's glow deepened as the dark gathered. From the kitchen window, he could see it holding its circle of light on the porch boards, spilling down the steps and onto the path that led into the orchard. The first few stars had begun to appear above the trees, and somewhere beyond them, the thin curve of a new moon rested low in the sky. When the carrots were done, he poured off most of the water and left them in the pot with a small knob of butter. The butter melted slowly, glossing the vegetables in gold. He set the bread and cheese on a plate, placed the carrots beside them, and carried the simple meal to the table near the window. He ate without hurry, taking time between bites to look out at the orchard. It had changed its face again since the afternoon. The rows now a pattern of shadow and lamplight, each tree standing as a dark silhouette against the softer dark of the sky. The lamp on the porch seemed to hold the whole scene together, its presence quiet but sure. As he finished the last of the bread, he thought of other evenings long past, suppers taken at this same table, but with voices filling the air, the clink of forks against plates, the scrape of a chair being pulled back from the table. Those nights had their own music, but the silence tonight was not a lesser thing. It was a different kind of fullness, made of the orchard outside, the lamp's warm circle of light, and the steady rhythm of his own breathing. When the meal was done, he carried the plate and cup to the sink, washing them slowly in the warm water, the sound of it mingling with the faint creak of the house settling into night. He dried each piece carefully, setting them back in their places. The sky beyond the window had deepened to a rich, quiet black, the stars now sharp and clear. He stepped out onto the porch, feeling the cool air touch his face. The lamp hummed faintly beside him, its glass warm to the touch. Beyond its light, the orchard stretched into shadow, the paths invisible now except in memory. He stood there a long while, one hand resting on the porch railing, watching as the night folded itself more fully around the house. Somewhere near the lower fence, a fox barked once, short and low, then moved on without another sound. Closer by, a single moth traced slow circles around the lamp before vanishing into the dark again. It was a good night, a night without hurry, without anything that needed to be fixed or solved. The lamp would keep its watch until morning, and he would rest in the same quiet keeping. Inside, the quilt would be waiting, and beyond the walls, the orchard would breathe its slow, deep rhythm until the first light returned. The quilt felt cool at first as Mr. Alton settled into his chair by the window, but it warmed quickly beneath his hands. The lamp's light poured across the floorboards, touching the edge of the rug and spilling in a pale pool at his feet. Beyond the glass, the orchard was only a darker shape against the night. Its lines softened until they seemed almost imagined. He could hear it more than see it now. The faint shift of leaves, the small creak of a branch moving under its own weight. He let his gaze drift, not searching for anything in particular, just following the slow rhythm of the evening. Some nights he read in this chair, but tonight there was no need for words on a page. The quiet was its own story, one he had heard many times before, and it asked nothing more than that he listen. It was in such moments, when the present was unhurried and complete, that the past would sometimes arrive, not in a rush, but like a gentle tide returning to a familiar shore. And so it came now, carrying him back to a winter many years ago. The memory began not with a sight, but with a sound, the muffled hush of snow falling thick over the orchard, and the soft thud of it landing on the porch roof. The lamp had been lit then too, casting its warm circle onto the whitened steps. He remembered stepping out into that light, pulling his coat tight against the cold, his boots sinking deep into the fresh snow. The air had been so still that each breath felt like a slow cloud, hanging in place before it dissolved into the night. That winter, the house had been fuller. There had been a fire burning in the stove, its crackle mixing with the sound of voices inside, a kind of music made from small things, the turning of pages, the scrape of a chair, the laughter of someone telling a story half whispered so as not to wake the youngest child asleep upstairs. He had walked the orchard path that night, just far enough to see the line of trees fade into the white darkness. The snow clung to the branches, weighing them low, and when a breeze passed, the air filled with a flurry of crystals, spinning briefly in the lamplight before vanishing into shadow. It had been the kind of night that made the world seem both endless and very small, as if everything worth keeping could fit into the warm glow of that lamp and the few rooms behind it. The memory shifted, as memories often do, to a different winter, this one later when the orchard was bare again, but without snow, a year when the cold had been dry and sharp. He saw himself mending the latch on the garden gate, his breath white in the air, while a thin thread of smoke curled from the chimney. From the kitchen window, a figure had been watching. One of the children, grown taller by then, holding a mug in both hands, steam rising between their face and the glass. He couldn't remember if it had been his son or his daughter that day, but the shape of that moment, the care in it, was as clear now as it had been then. Back in the present, the night held steady around him. The orchard's breath was slower now, as if it too had drifted toward sleep. The lamp burned on without flicker, its light holding the space between the house and the first line of trees. He leaned back in the chair, letting the quilt settle over him like a second kind of evening. Somewhere down the road, a car passed, its engine low and distant, and then the silence closed again, as though nothing had moved at all. His eyes wandered to the table beside him, where an old pocket watch lay. It had belonged to his father, its chain worn smooth from years of turning in a familiar hand. The watch no longer kept perfect time, but he wound it anyway, listening to the quiet tick that followed. It was not about the hour it showed, it was about the thread it carried, tying him to all the evenings that had come before, and to those that would still arrive of as long as the lamp in the orchard stood. Outside, a faint wind stirred, bringing with it the scent of wood smoke and the cold edge of autumn. It slipped through the window's small opening, curling into the room just enough to remind him of the season's turn. He welcomed it, the way one welcomes a known guest, for it carried no surprise, only the comfort of something returning in its own time. He closed his eyes for a moment, not to sleep, but to let the night settle more deeply around him. Somewhere in the orchard, an owl called once, its voice low and certain, and in that sound was the same promise the lamp gave, that the night could be trusted to keep its own watch, and that here, in this circle of light, he was exactly where he should be. The chair gave a soft creak as Mr. Alton leaned forward, setting the quilt aside and resting his hands on the worn arms for a moment. The pocket watch ticked on the table, a small, patient heartbeat in the quiet room. Beyond the window, the lamp still held its steady glow, its light catching on the railings of the porch, making them gleam faintly against the darker shapes beyond. He rose slowly, not because of stiffness, but because he preferred the act of standing to have no rush about it. The air in the room had cooled, and he reached for the old cardigan that hung on a peg by the door. It smelled faintly of cedar, from the small block he kept in the closet to keep the moths away, and the sleeves had stretched just enough to fit his arms like a memory. Opening the door, he stepped out into the night. The first touch of the evening air carried a kind of sharpness, not unfriendly, just a clear reminder that summer's warmth had stepped aside for autumn. The porch boards under his feet still held a little of the day's heat, but the edges of the steps felt cool, and the gravel path beyond gave off the faint scent of dust and apple skins. He moved toward the lamp, its glass glowing amber in the dark. A few small insects circled lazily near it, their wings catching the light before they disappeared back into the dark. The lamp itself was warm when he placed his hand gently on the post, a low hum of heat radiating outward. He checked the wick, turning it ever so slightly to keep the flame just high enough, bright enough to mark the path, but not so high that it would burn itself out too soon. From here, the orchard seemed both near and far. The first row of trees stood within the lamp's reach, their leaves faintly silvered at the edges by the light. Beyond that, the rest of the orchard dissolved into a shadowed mass, its shapes and distances guessed at more than seen. It was a familiar vanishing, one he had known since boyhood, when he would look out into the night and imagine all the quiet life moving there. Foxes padding between the trees, owls turning their heads towards some sound too faint for him to hear, the slow breath of the earth itself under the roots. He rested both hands on the railing, feeling the faint tackiness of the wood where the evening dew had begun to gather. Somewhere in the orchard, a leaf loosened from its branch, turning end over end until it landed softly on the ground. He didn't see it fall, but the sound of it, the smallest whisper, reached him in the stillness. His gaze drifted upward to the stars. It was a clear night, and the dark above seemed endless, though he knew its boundaries were closer than the heart could ever quite understand. He traced the slow arc of a constellation his father had once shown him, long before this orchard was his. In those days, standing out here at night had been a way of feeling both small and held, a reminder that the world was wide, and yet it contained spaces, like this one, that belonged to you in a way no one could take. The wind shifted slightly, bringing the faintest scent of wood smoke from a house farther down the road. It mingled with the orchard's own smell, apples cooling in the dark, the damp earth around their fallen leaves. It was a scent he could have recognized anywhere, even if years had passed without it. He thought briefly of the nights when the lamp had been lit for someone's return, a neighbor walking the road late, a son or daughter making their way home from a long day, the light standing there like a small promise. You'll find your way, and when you do, someone will be here. Tonight, there was no one expected, but the lamp burned all the same. Habit, yes, but also something more than that. A kind of devotion to the idea that light should always be waiting for whatever the dark might bring. He stayed there until the air pressed a little colder against his cheeks. The quilt was still warm inside, and the chair by the window would be waiting. But before he turned back toward the door, he gave the lamp one last glance, not to check it, but to acknowledge it, the way one might nod to an old friend who had taken up a post beside you for many years. The door gave a soft sigh as he closed it behind him. Inside, the air seemed even warmer after the coolness outside. He hung the cardigan back on its peg, the scent of cedar following him as he crossed the room. The quilt welcomed him again, and he settled into the chair with the ease of someone who knows there is nowhere else he needs to be tonight. Outside, the lamp kept its quiet watch, its glow resting on the porch boards, spilling onto the first stones of the path. The orchard beyond remained in its slow, unhurried dark, a dark that was never empty, only resting. The chair received him again, the way an old friend might, without ceremony, but with a quiet knowing. The quilt lay over his knees, its weight light enough to forget, yet present enough to remind him that the night outside carried a chill. The lamplight from the porch stretched into the room in a thin, warm ribbon, falling across the floorboards and touching the edge of his boot. He leaned back, letting his body find that familiar curve in the chair's backrest, and simply listened. The night had a way of speaking, though it never used words. It spoke in the faint shift of the rafters overhead, a slow, almost imperceptible creak as the wood adjusted to the cool air settling around it. It spoke in the small ticking from the pocket watch, steady as a heartbeat, and in the distant chorus of crickets who kept their own unhurried time. Somewhere far enough away to sound like a memory, a train horn drifted across the hills. Its low, drawn-out note was softened by the distance, as if wrapped in layers of fog and night air, but still it reached him. He imagined the slow procession of cars following that call, each carrying its own small world. A man reading beneath a dim lamp, a child asleep their head against the window, a conductor moving quietly down the aisle. He closed his eyes for a moment, not to drift into sleep, but to let the sounds find their places in the room. The wind moved next, barely brushing against the window pane, making it hum the faintest single-note tune. It was the same sound he'd heard here since boyhood, and in it there was something both present and eternal, as if the wind carried every other night it had touched this glass. A faint tapping drew his attention to the far wall. It was the loose branch of the lilac bush outside, shifting just enough to knock gently against the siding. The rhythm was irregular, but not without pattern, like a neighbor knocking softly at a door only to remember they had nothing urgent to say. He had always liked that sound in autumn. In summer, the lilac was alive with bees and fragrance, its branches so full they seemed to breathe. But in autumn, it was bare enough for the wind to pass through without resistance, making this kind of delicate music. He thought of nights from years past when he'd been too busy to notice such things. There had been seasons when the orchard was not just a companion, but a taskmaster. Trees to prune, soil to turn, fences to mend before the frost. In those years, the nights had been for sleeping hard and deep, not for sitting still and listening. He wondered if the orchard had noticed his absence then, or if it had simply carried on with its own breathing, waiting for him to return to this quieter way of being. From the kitchen, the old clock chimed the half hour. Its tone was slightly muted, as if it had been softened over decades of use. He didn't check the time. There was no need. The night wasn't measured in hours here, but in moments. The way the lamp's flame swayed slightly when the wind found it, the way a cricket's song would pause only to be picked up by another somewhere else in the grass. He shifted slightly in the chair, and the floor beneath him gave a small groan. The sound of wood remembering footsteps. He smiled at the thought that this very board had likely heard hundreds of such shifts in size, each one carrying its own private thoughts. Beyond the orchard, the hills held their silence like a deep breath. He imagined the fields lying there under the stars, the tall grasses bending to the wind's will, the small creek slipping quietly between rocks. Even the night creatures, the fox moving along a hedgerow, the barn owl watching from its perch, seemed to be moving at a pace that asked nothing of the clock. He found that his own breath had matched that rhythm, slow, steady, as if in conversation with the world outside. The weight of the day had loosened in his chest, falling away without notice, like leaves from a branch that had held them long enough. For a while, he sat without thinking of past or future. There was only this: the lamplight, the orchard's shadow, the gentle agreements between the night and the small life within it. When he opened his eyes again, the flame in the lamp outside was still holding steady, though a little lower now, as if even it were beginning to lean toward rest. He thought he might let it burn just a while longer before trimming it down. After all, there were still hours yet before morning came, and the night had not finished telling its quiet story. The flame outside leaned ever so slightly in the breeze, its glow catching on the faint curve of the orchard's first row of branches. From his chair, Mr. Alton watched without urgency, his hands resting loosely on the quilt, his breathing matched to the slow, even rise and fall of the night. It was in these quiet spaces, between the tick of the watch and the sigh of the wind, that memories seemed to arrive, not as sudden visitors, but as old friends stepping through an open gate. Tonight, it was his father who came first, not in the way of a photograph, where the image holds still and the edges are too sharp, but in the way of a memory that moves, a shape shifting in the lamplight, a voice softened by distance yet unmistakable. He could see them as they had been on a night many decades ago. The same orchard, though the trees then were younger, their trunks slimmer and their branches reaching upward as if still learning how to settle into the earth. The air had been cool that night too, though in his memory there was more moisture in it, as if a rain had passed earlier in the day. His father had been sitting in this very chair, back when the chair still lived on the porch. Young Alton had stood beside him, barefoot on the boards, feeling the leftover warmth of the day seeping into his soles. The lamp had been newly cleaned, its glass clear, the flame steady in the still air. "What do you hear?" his father had asked, not in the impatient way of someone testing for an answer, but with the open curiosity of one who truly wished to know. Alton had tilted his head, hearing first the obvious things: the crickets, the soft hum of wind against the house, the rustle of a branch nearby. But his father had waited, and after a while, he began to notice other sounds. The creak of the orchard gate in the distance, the gentle trickle of the small creek that ran behind the far row of trees, the faint shifting of the gravel path as a rabbit hopped across it. "It's all speaking," his father had said at last. "Most folks think the world goes quiet at night, but it doesn't stop. It just changes the way it talks." He had remembered that, carrying the thought with him through the years like a folded note in a pocket. And now, decades later, he was here again, hearing the world's slower voice, feeling the truth of his father's words settle deeper. The memory stretched further. He recalled how, after a long stretch of listening, his father had leaned forward, cupping his hands around the lamp to shield it while he adjusted the wick. There had been something deliberate in that gesture, as though tending the lamp was not just about keeping light on the porch, but about honoring the night itself. When the flame settled again, his father had leaned back, and together they'd watched a moth draw close, circling the glass once, twice before settling briefly on the warm metal. Young Alton had asked why the lamp was always lit, even on nights when no one was expected. His father's answer had been simple. "Light is a kind of welcome. You never know when someone might need to see it." Those words, too, had stayed with him, not as a rule to follow, but as something that had quietly shaped the way he moved through the years. It was why the lamp still burned tonight, even though the road beyond the orchard was empty, and the only footsteps to follow the path would be his own. In the present moment, he shifted slightly in the chair, feeling the wood's familiar give beneath his back. The quilt's weight was steady on his knees. Outside, the lamp's glow caught in the corners of the porch railing, making the edges seem almost golden against the dark. A leaf tumbled across the yard, rolling and pausing in the way leaves do when the wind has a playful mood. He thought of how much the orchard had seen, how many nights it had stood under the lamp's watch, how many voices had passed along its paths. Some of those voices were gone now, their owners resting in the small cemetery at the edge of town. But the orchard seemed to hold them all, in the way that certain places can hold time without letting it harden into stone. A faint shiver of wind brushed the window again, and he imagined it carrying with it the sound of his father's voice, not in words, but in the same tone he had heard that night as a boy, the tone of someone content simply to be there, with no need to fill the air with anything more than presence. The memory eased back into the night as gently as it had arrived. In its place was the soft awareness of the present, the lamplight, the orchard, the quiet hum of the world speaking in its slower tongue. Mr. Alton let his eyes half close, the edges of the room blurring, the night beyond the glass becoming a dark, comforting sea. He would tend the lamp again before turning in, but not just yet. For now, it was enough to sit, to breathe, and to feel the nearness of all the moments, past and present, that had ever been held in this quiet corner of the world. It was not often that the lamp left its place on the porch. Over the years, it had become as much a fixture as the orchard gate or the curve of the gravel path, steady, unchanging, reliable. But there had been one night long ago when the lamp's light had wandered deeper into the orchard. The memory came to Mr. Alton now, unhurried, like the slow drift of a cloud across a still pond. It had been early autumn then, the kind where the air was cool but not sharp, and the leaves were only just beginning to trade their greens for softer golds and rusts. The afternoon had slipped into evening with the ease of a curtain drawing closed, and the orchard had been filled with that deep, settling quiet that comes when the day's work is done. He remembered his mother at the kitchen window, her hands in a bowl of dough, humming a tune she never seemed to sing in daylight. That evening, his father had stepped onto the porch, lamp in hand, and said simply, "Come on, son." Let's take her for a walk." Young Alton had followed, curious, watching the steady swing of the light as it bobbed ahead of them down the steps and onto the narrow path that wound between the trees. The orchard felt different at night. The familiar spaces, rows of trees, low stone walls, patches of grass worn by footsteps, were the same but softened. The lamp's glow touched only a few feet in any direction, leaving the rest to shadow and imagination. The ground was cool beneath his shoes, and each step stirred the scent of apples fallen earlier that day, their skins beginning to bruise and sweeten in the damp air. They walked without talking for a long while. Now and then his father would pause to lift the lamp towards a branch, inspecting a cluster of fruit still hanging heavy in the dark. The light would spill over the leaves, revealing their gentle curl at the edges, the veins that caught the glow like faint rivers on a map. They came, at last, to the far end of the orchard, where the fence bent inward toward a small wooden gate. Beyond it lay a meadow, and beyond that, the slope that led down toward the creek. Here, the lamp was set carefully atop a fence post, its light casting an amber circle onto the grass at their feet. His father had leaned against the post, gazing out into the darkness. After a moment, he had said something that stayed with Alton all his life. "Sometimes you bring the light where it's needed, not where it's comfortable to keep it." At the time, Alton had only half understood. He thought his father meant the orchard, the way the lamp's glow had shown them where the ground was uneven or where low branches might catch a shoulder. But as the years went on, he came to feel the weight of those words in other ways. How light, whether from a lamp or a kind gesture, could reach into the loneliest corners of a life. They'd stood there a long while that night, saying little. The meadow had been quiet except for the low rustle of grass and the faint call of an owl somewhere beyond the creek. When they turned back toward home, the lamp's circle of light seemed smaller, but warmer somehow, as though it had learned something in its time away from the porch. In the present, the memory eased itself back into Mr. Alton's quiet room. The lamp still burned outside now, its light steady against the orchard's edge. He thought of that walk, of the way the night had wrapped around them without threat, of how the lamp had seemed to carry not just light but companionship. The truth was, he had not taken the lamp far from its place in years, but he wondered, just for a moment, if he might again. Not because the orchard had changed, but because sometimes even the familiar needs to be seen in a new circle of light. Beyond the glass, the branches stirred, their leaves whispering in tones too soft for words. The air was cooler now, the kind that made you draw your quilt a little closer and breathe more slowly. The lamp's glow caught on a patch of moss along the fence. The green brightened into a color that didn't seem to belong to night at all. Mr. Alton sat back, the memory still warm in him. There was a comfort in knowing the lamp had wandered once and could again if the time called for it. And there was comfort too in letting it rest tonight, holding its place in the quiet, a welcome that needed no reason to be offered. It was a little past 8 when the sound came. Soft, deliberate footsteps on the gravel path beyond the porch. They weren't hurried or hesitant, but carried the steady rhythm of someone who knew where they were going, even if they hadn't been there in a while. Mr. Alton, sitting in his old chair by the window, glanced up from the thin book resting on his knee. The lamp on the porch cast its warm light outward, just far enough to touch the outline of a figure moving slowly along the path. For a moment, the glow caught on the brim of a hat and the curve of a scarf before the person stepped fully into view. It was Clara Mayfield. He hadn't seen her in years, perhaps since the spring market the town held every April. She'd grown older, of course, as they all had, but her face still held that same open kindness, the kind that made you feel you were welcome before you even reached her. Her hands were tucked into the deep pockets of her coat, and she moved with the unhurried pace of someone taking the long way home. "Evening, Alton," she said softly when she reached the porch steps. Her voice carried a hint of the cool air, but also something warmer, like tea steeped just right. "I saw the lamp from the road. Thought I'd stop in for a minute, if you don't mind." He didn't mind. In truth, the lamp had been lit for just such a thing, for the neighbor or the friend who might find their way by its glow. He pushed himself up slowly, joints answering with the quiet protests of age, and opened the door wide. "Come in out of the chill," he said, stepping back to let her through. As she crossed the threshold, the smell of the orchard drifted in with her, crisp and faintly sweet, with the tang of fallen leaves beginning to break down into the earth. The house, lit only by the lamp on the porch and a smaller one on the table, felt like it was holding its breath. Clara settled into the chair across from his, glancing around the room with the ease of someone who'd been there before, even if only in memory. Her eyes lingered on the shelf by the far wall, where a row of glass jars caught the light like small captured sunsets. "You still keep preserves," she said, a quiet smile in her voice. "I remember your late wife used to give me a jar of apple butter every autumn." Alton's gaze softened at the mention. "She made enough for half the town. I just keep the shelves full out of habit now." They talked in the way people do when neither is in a hurry, letting the pauses be as much a part of the conversation as the words. She told him of her small garden on the edge of town, how the frost had come earlier than she'd expected this year, how she'd taken to sitting by her own kitchen window in the evenings with a quilt around her shoulders. He told her of the orchard, how the harvest had been good, how the lamp seemed to draw more moths now than it used to. After a time, Clara's gaze wandered toward the porch. From where she sat, she could see the lamp's light stretching just far enough to brush the nearest apple tree. "It's a good thing you keeping that lamp lit," she said. "It makes the road feel less empty. Some nights I think it's the only thing out here that remembers how to welcome a person." Her words settled into him like the warmth of a second blanket. He thought of the night with his father, long ago when they'd carried the lamp into the orchard. The memory felt closer now, as if her visit had opened a door for it to step through. They didn't speak much after that. The quiet between them was companionable, and the lamp's light seemed to hum softly against the dark. When she finally rose to leave, Alton walked her to the porch, the boards creaking gently beneath their feet. The night air had cooled further, and a faint mist hung low among the trees. The lamp's glow looked almost solid against it, a warm circle cut from the dark. Clara stood for a moment at the bottom of the steps looking toward the road. "I'll see you again before too long," she said, and though the words were simple, they carried the weight of something promised. He watched as she walked back down the path, her figure shrinking into shadow until only the sound of her footsteps remained. When even that had faded, he turned back toward the house, but not before resting his hand lightly on the lamp's frame. Inside, he lowered himself into his chair once more. The room seemed a little warmer now, the night a little gentler, and though the lamp still burned steadily outside, it felt as though its light had stretched further than the orchard, perhaps all the way to the place where Clara's quiet steps were still making their way home. The night deepened in that slow, almost imperceptible way it does in small towns, when the edges of everything dissolve into shadow, and the only things that remain clear are the nearest light and the sound of your own breathing. Mr. Alton had been sitting by the window long after Clara's visit, his book still open but unread, the words blurring into the quiet. The air inside the house had cooled, and he pulled the knitted throw, one his wife had made, over his lap. From the porch, the lamp's glow softened the darkness, spilling onto the wooden boards in the first few feet of the gravel path. Moths circled it in slow, aimless arcs, their wings catching the light for a heartbeat before vanishing again into shadow. Beyond the orchard, the rest of the town lay hushed. Somewhere a dog barked once and then stopped, as if remembering it was night. It was the kind of stillness that seemed to open old drawers in the mind, the ones that held things you hadn't thought of in years. Alton felt that pull, now, not of sadness, but of recollection, gentle and persistent. He leaned forward, reached for the small writing desk by the wall, and drew out a sheet of thick, cream-colored paper. The pen, worn smooth from years of use, fit into his hand as naturally as if it had been waiting there all this time. He hadn't written to anyone in months. Letters had fallen out of fashion long ago, but there was someone, his niece, Margaret, who still appreciated them. She lived 2 towns over in a narrow house above her bakery, and once in a while she would send him a short note, always written in her looping hand always scented faintly of cinnamon. Tonight he found himself wanting to answer her last letter, though it was weeks old now. He dipped the pen in ink and began slowly, letting the words form without haste. Dear Margaret, I'm writing this by the light of the porch lamp. It's been lit every night this week, and I think of it as a quiet sentinel, watching over the orchard and perhaps over me too. This evening, Clara Mayfield came by. We spoke for a while, and it reminded me how much comfort there is in the unhurried company of a neighbor. The lines came easily, not because there was much to tell, but because small things had their own weight. He wrote of the frost edging the farthest apple trees, of the last of the jars of apple butter, of the way the air smelled just before sunset. As he wrote, he realized he was also writing to himself, anchoring the day so it wouldn't slip away entirely. Halfway through the letter, his gaze wandered back to the porch. The lamp's glow was steady, but beyond it, the orchard had become a sea of dark shapes and pale glints where moonlight caught on bare branches. He remembered his father's words from decades ago, when they had carried that very lamp into the orchard on a winter's night. Light is a way of telling the dark you're still here. That thought stayed with him as he finished the letter. He signed it simply, with love, Uncle Alton, and set the pen down. For a moment he didn't move, listening to the faint ticking of the clock in the kitchen. The letter would be posted in the morning, but he already imagined Margaret's hands opening it, the way she might pause over certain lines, perhaps smiling at the mention of the lamp. Outside, the night air shifted and the branches nearest the porch stirred. The lamp's halo swayed slightly as if nodding in approval. Alton leaned back in his chair, the letter resting on the desk, and let his eyes close for a while. Not to sleep yet, but to rest in that in-between place where the mind drifts without worry. In that space he thought again of Clara's words, of the road feeling less empty because of the lamp. It seemed to him that maybe the light was doing more than keeping watch over the orchard. Maybe it was stitching together these small connections between himself and Clara, between himself and Margaret, between anyone who had ever seen it and felt just a little more at home in the world. When he finally opened his eyes, the room was as it had been, warm and quiet. The lamp still burned, steady as breath, and the orchard beyond seemed to be listening. Tomorrow, he thought, he might polish the lamp's glass, maybe trim back the branches that leaned too far over the path. But for now, it was enough to sit and let its light carry the night forward, minute by minute, into whatever gentle ending it had in store. Morning came in soft layers. The first light did not rush in, but crept slowly over the orchard, touching the frost-tipped branches and glazing them with a pale gold. The lamp, still faintly warm from the night, stood like a sentinel who had completed its watch. Its glow was gone now, replaced by the steady brightness of day, but something of its presence lingered in the air, an invisible comfort that could not be switched off with the twist of a hand. Alton rose earlier than usual, though he had slept well. He moved through the familiar motions of making tea, the kettle's whistle low and unhurried, the steam curling up like a signal to no one in particular. The letter to Margaret lay on the desk, neatly folded and waiting. He slipped it into an envelope, sealed it, and wrote her name in the careful script that had not changed in decades. Outside, the gravel path was crisp beneath his boots, each step releasing a small crunch into the cold morning. He paused by the lamp and laid a hand on its iron post. The glass still held a faint trace of his own reflection, ghost-like in the dimness of the previous night. At the end of the lane, the postman would come by later in the morning, but Alton preferred to walk into town himself. The walk was neither far nor hurried, just enough to remind him of the rhythm between here and there. The orchard trees stood quietly, their branches bare but not lifeless, as if they were simply gathering their strength for the seasons ahead. In town, he stopped by the post office, exchanging a few words with Mrs. Klein behind the counter. She took the letter, gave it a small pat as if it were a living thing, and promised it would be on its way by afternoon. The thought of it moving steadily and invisibly toward Margaret's hands was a comfort. On the way back, Alton took the long path by the river. The water moved in slow folds, carrying with it the thin ice that clung stubbornly to its edges. Here and there, sunlight caught on the ripples, flashing in brief, bright moments before they smoothed away. He thought of how life often moved like that, quiet currents, small lights, nothing grand, yet all of it essential. By the time he reached home, the sun had climbed higher. He set the kettle on again and opened the porch door. From this angle, the lamp seemed simply part of the landscape, as natural as the trees behind it. But as evening came on, the shadows deepened, and he found himself drawn once more to its light. That night, Alton lit the lamp a little earlier than usual. The air was colder, the kind that carried the scent of distant wood smoke, and he thought of travelers on the road, rare though they were, who might see it from afar. He imagined how it might look to them, a small, steadfast glow, marking the presence of someone who had not forgotten how to wait. Later, after supper, he stepped onto the porch and stood beside the lamp. The orchard lay still, its branches holding the moonlight like water in a shallow bowl. Somewhere, beyond the reach of the light, the world continued, people speaking, doors opening and closing, the slow shifting of days. But here, there was only the lamp, the trees, and the quiet. He thought of all the nights it had shone, through storms, through long winters, through evenings of joy and evenings of absence, and he knew it would keep shining in its own small way, even after he was gone. Inside, he settled back into his chair, pulling the knitted throw over his knees. The light outside filtered through the curtains, a soft, steady presence. He closed his eyes, not with the heaviness of exhaustion, but with the ease of someone who has done what he could for the day. And so, the lamp in the orchard kept watch, over the path, over the trees, over the quiet heartbeat of a small American town. It asked for nothing and offered itself freely, night after night, as if to say to anyone passing by, "You are not alone." And so the lamp in the orchard will keep its quiet vigil, long after tonight has faded into memory. Its light will fall softly across the path, through the branches, and into the hearts of anyone who happens to pass by, reminding them, as it reminded us, that there is comfort in small, steadfast things. May you carry that light with you now into your own night, letting it guide you toward a deep and peaceful rest. As you settle beneath the covers, let the noise of the day drift away. Breathe in the stillness, feel the weight of your body sink into the safety of this moment, and know that you are safe, you are cared for, and you are not alone. Sleep well, dear friend. May your dreams be gentle, and your heart be light when morning comes. If this story has brought you a little peace tonight, I'd love to hear from you. What story would you like me to tell next? Your thoughts are always welcome here. Until then, good night.